right now we have our talk that we have the title showing there. I think it is interesting as time passes and application grows, the decisions and the patterns that have been talked about emerge and can sometimes become real hindrances on our day-to-day, right? One topic that's I've seen happen multiple times is the state management, right? Specifically when you're talking about the global state. And even more especially when those applications are split into micro frontends, which is quite common nowadays. Our next speakers, Andrei Bechet and Jann Deterling, are here to tell us their twisted tales of lightweight state management in a micro frontend architecture. They plan to elaborate on the challenges of a global state and how keeping it to a minimum can avoid coupling. So Andrei and Jann, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. Hopefully you're enjoying your time here. And for those who are joining just now, welcome to XConf. My name is Andrei. I'm wearing a gray t-shirt, and I will be pairing today on this presentation with Jann, who will be taking over in the second half of the presentation. We are both software developers for Thoughtworks, a global software consultancy, and we've been working on the same project for a bit more than a year, and we'd love to tell you more about our twisted tale through this lightweight state management, and yeah, let's get on with it. So what to expect? As we said, we're going to show how we evolved our application to match the ever-changing requirements. We've had quite some fun there. What this talk is not about. We're not going to give you a full case study for or against micro frontends, or we're not going to go into the details of what are the possible methods to use for state management and how can you simplify that. Rather, we're going to stick to our journey and what led to the decisions and so on. Now, the context. Well, our story basically is about a heavy application which is at the crossroads between multiple, very different domains. And our end game as the integration team, and a bit more than that, would be to afford teams working on the different parts of the application the freedom to make case-by-case decisions and be able to increment and upgrade their parts as they see fit. And this is not all, because we are at the crossroads of the multiple domains. We also get to talk to more APIs, some being legacy systems, some being new, some have access to database, some don't. And yeah, and as we promised, we're going to start, we promised the story, so let's get on with the beginning. Because this project started as a greenfield project, we have started with one repository containing one React app. And the whole front-end application looked like this. As I mentioned earlier, multiple domains coming together in this application, and we try to keep them separated with a thin boundary within the app, basically by placing them in different packages. And we were anticipating that at one point we might change them. And anyways, it's good happen. Information was flowing via props. If you don't know what props are, basically, props are inputs into your components. It's a React way of giving this out. So in this very simple example, a value can flow downwards via props, and information can also flow upwards by sending a callback inside the props, like the on-click one. Well, this looks very nice and simple, right? And that is indeed nice and simple for a small application. However, we don't have a small application on our hands. And as you might imagine, it was quite easy to lose track of what was going on there. We were like getting lost more often than ever. And we started to identify that some data and some functionality was being used throughout. So this kind of looked like a global state, right? And then, okay, we took a small excursion and then examined a couple of possibilities in a generic way without tying ourselves to additional libraries or frameworks. We just wanted to see what's out there. First option could be, why not store it in the local or session storage? Comes with the browser, it's easy to access irrespective of which framework you might be using. But however, again, we have multiple domains, and this kind of feels like microservices sharing one database, and we know that there are better ideas for that thing. So maybe we'll take a pause. The next one would be the reducer pattern. right? I think if you've been using Redux or other tools out there, you probably are familiar with this one. It's basically a global functions and a means to upgrade the global state. And note that this might need some additional plugging, and it can lead to coupling. A third option would be to simply pass in events between the modules or the components. This again comes with the browser, and it's accessible in whatever framework you might be using, using window dispatch event or post. And the solution, on the contrary to the reducer pattern, leads to a more decoupled architecture. However, there are other problems there. We'll get to that later. And the fourth option, since I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier slides that we have access to some databases and some backends, why not handle it in the backend, right? I mean, just pass in an ID and everything behind this ID tells us the state, and every other component can just access it as they might need it. Simplifies our front end as well, and makes our lives easier. However, we are aware that the solution might not be for any kind of application. It just happens to work for us. So let's come back to our context, right? Our simple React app passing information via props. We started using the reducer pattern using plain React. We didn't want to introduce a new library out there, and React has some nice tools. So all our components, or their components, which are interested in the global state, basically get to access a context object, and this context object is nothing more than just a representation of the state and a way to migrate it, to mutate it, to change it to some new state, some new version. And how might we do that? Because we said that we don't like props in our case, because it could easily grow out of proportion. We can share this context object via context providers in React. And that is fairly straightforward in React. Is in the first two lines, you can see how we can create our context. The second line is how we would plug it in with the rest of the components. It would be in the early stages of this of our application. And then the last line would be an example of how one component, how someone might use in their component this context. And yeah, and coming back, what is a reducer? How does that work? Well, the reducer is just the function which takes the current state and an action to help get to the new value of the state. And React provides something for that. It's a use reducer hook. And that one takes exactly these two inputs. One, the function itself, which is nothing more than a JavaScript function. +1, kudos for testing, very easy. And then default values. In our case, we decided to take the default values from storage. And this is how roughly looks like in it looked like in our app at that stage. We created the state and the reducer with this user reducer hook, and then we simply shared it to all the components via two providers, one for the reducer function, another one for the state. If you want to know more why we did that, we're going to share a link later. We gave a talk last summer, and you can see more about this one. But coming back to our topic, as time passed and our team grew bigger, we ended up splitting into two teams because the domain was getting too complicated, too much to handle by the same team. And we knew that we were waiting a third team to join with yet another domain. So we decided to split our application into multiple repositories. You remember I mentioned earlier that we already kept them quite nicely the domain boundaries. Well, we did exactly just that. We created multiple repositories and still kept that one repository containing the React app, which brought everything together. And yeah, sure, we can call them micro-frontends. Let's say they can also be modules. Teams could work individually in their own repositories, have their own flow. The modules or micro-frontends would then get pushed to an artifact storage. And then the integration app would have the job to go look into the artifact storage, take the latest version or the desired version, bring it to production. State handling remained unchanged. Still the reducer shared via context, but because we are now no longer in the same code base, we have to figure out a bit how we can share this context object, right, to leave the experience the same inside the models. And what we came up with was basically extracting the reducer function, the action types one could dispatch to change the state, and how the state looks like into a common library. And if you would be working inside one of the modules or micro-frontends, for you, technically, the workflow wouldn't change much. It would still feel the same. You'd still access it via a hook. However, now this comes from an external library. And yeah, we might have like made our whole life like maybe a bit easier by creating smaller repositories, or which makes our code more maintainable, maybe more cohesive. But if we look back to one of our objectives, the freedom aspect, right? Let's be honest, we're not there yet, right? We just made our whole modules a lot more coupled by tying them down to this common library containing the state and the reducer function. And if any of the micro-frontends needs additional or needs to change something in the state, then they need to talk to the rest of the teams, the rest of the people, update it in the common library, and then have the change be also deployed throughout. Not cool. So deployment became a mess, really as a side effect, nasty one. Now, rather than having just one step, we need to have multiple. And in the first one, teams would be working in their own modules. They would push to the source control, have the build and test, of course, where they would pull the common library in. And then if everything went fine, all the tests were green, then we would push to the artifact repository. But then we need to also have the second step with the main app, where the main app gets the new modules, runs its own build and test pipeline, and then brings it to production. So we basically need to decouple. It's clear. It's a good intermediary step. It's a good, easier step to do. This is not we're not there yet. And also our requirements have started evolving at this point. We were expecting even more teams to build components and parts of our application, and they might not even want to use React at all, but they might still need access to some of the data. So we need to figure out a way. Let's be honest, also, let's make our lives easier. Right now, the whole development experience is less fun and desirable, and we could definitely do some work there and improve it. And then, of course, simplify our state. After quite some time, some accidental complexity already crept in, we can definitely have a look there as well. So in order to address these concerns, right, we had to review basically our whole architecture decisions and what are possible steps we could take to evolve this to a better place. And for that, I'll hand it over to Jan.
Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. Just for short notice, I'm wearing a dark black shirt and having short hair. We'll talk about how we basically evolved from that build time integration that we had previously, where everything came together in that one big application, to a more lightweight solution that we figured out throughout the last year. Oh, sorry, that was in the wrong direction. So basically what we are now wanting to describe is a runtime integration. Previously, we had that build time integration, multiple pipelines, and one pipeline integrating them all together. And when I talk about a runtime integration, I mean that everything will be consumed and bundled together in the client browser directly and not in a build before the client browser will download it. And that works like that the client browser downloads an initial bundle. And this initial bundle points basically to the different micro-frontend locations. The client browser can then go ahead, download each micro-frontend and compose them together in the client browser. And that makes our life a bit easier since it helps us to really decouple our build pipelines. So every build pipeline now is truly decoupled and can run independently, deploy their own app, and then everything comes together in the client browser. That also brings some challenges, especially for state management, since it's way harder for us to manage that common library So let's talk about that. What's about our state? And let's take one step back actually to our context that we had. So you remember we're having that one shared library stating a lot of dependencies to different state actions that we can dispatch, how to change the state. And we had that big context object, which is basically lying above all the micro-frontends that we had. And one major problem here is whenever a new team joins our product, they might not write their product or their micro-frontend in React anymore. They might want to use Angular.js, they might want to use Vue.js or something else. We don't really want to force them into use React. So our current solution won't work anymore. Sure, there are other solutions like using Redux or another workaround for that. But we still had an issue with that because it's a shared and a direct code dependency. And that really made the developer experience really bad, as Andrei already said, that our problem here is whenever one team goes and wants to change the state and add some additional structure to it or some additional information or some actions, then it will become worse because the other teams have to upgrade their dependency to the common library as well. And if they don't do so, your build might break and the whole application will fall apart. That's exactly the opposite that you really want to do, because somehow your state needs to be in sync between all the teams, and it makes it way harder for you to really manage that overall state that we want to share. So we can conclude sharing a state across these micro front ends in the way we proposed previously is pretty tricky, and we wanted to come up with a different solution, which is way easier for us. So how did we evolve? So what did we do instead? And basically we tried, first of all, to reduce the state to the bare minimum that is possible. We will show you later what we actually did, but first we want to set some ground rules why we did that. First of all, we really wanted to decouple all the domains that we had, because each team should be as separate as possible to really have the independence that they can work on their own domain and don't have to look too much to the left and to the right to basically work on their own product. Furthermore, it lowers the complexity in the overall front end that we had. The shared reducer was quite heavy and it was quite complex to understand for new teams that joined the product or new members who joined the project. And last but not least, we want to show you how we evolved it. And basically, we tried to move the state close to our components. And the benefit of doing that is that components can manage their own state. They are now able to maintain the state, to manipulate it. And we also said that we don't want to share state unless we really have to. Previously, we sometimes felt like, okay, we just put it to the global state because there might be another component that can make use of it. And now we're trying the exact opposite. We won't share anything unless we really need to do that. And we do that because it reduces side effects for us. Common side effects of state is when you have multiple micro front ends, there might be one micro front end which can manipulate that global state, which has direct implications on your component, and then will change your component. So it makes it really hard to track down any bugs or any problems that you have with your own components when it comes from another domain that you might not know about that well. So that was also one of the major reasons why we felt it was super hard to maintain that real big shared context. So now you're sure, or we are sure that we need, that we still need a shared state, and this state needs to live somewhere. And Andrei also mentioned one option, and we decided to do it in the backend. We know there are some apps that might not have a backend, and for them it's probably not possible to do that, but we think we still have some options in our talk that you can apply to you, or that can be applied to your application. For us, it was the easiest step to do it in the backend, and it really helped us, as said, to lower the complexity in the front end, because we now only have to talk to one API, and talking to that API is way easier than basically managing that direct code dependency as we described. Furthermore, it's a resilient solution. We can way easier go back to that state and restore that state over and over again. And it's only a single point of truth. So we always know when we go to that ID or load the data from the backend, it will always return us the data that we expect. And that was for us way harder to do it in the front end. And last thing is we favor APIs over code dependencies. APIs are usually a bit easier to test, and it's also easier to have contract tests across multiple teams to really see if we are having the right structure, if we can apply the right actions on these APIs. In code dependencies, as we stated, it's way harder to do that. So let's now get into that. How did we do that actually? And we decided to pass unique identifiers, basically IDs between our applications via the URL, because the URL is always there in the front end and makes our life way easier just passing that. So an example would be that we have 3 micro-frontends and all of them talk to an offer API. Micro-frontend 1 might create an offer, and whenever it created the offer, it will put the offer ID just in the URL and then pass it on to the next application. The next application can read it from the URL and might load the state, might manipulate the state. That's up to them. That's up to the domain of that micro-frontend. And that for us made it really lightweight and very easy to translate state over the different micro-frontends that we had. So just to bring another example in here, we have a small button that will actually do what I just described. That will create, in an on-click method, it will create an offer, and then in the next line, it will basically push to the history. The history object in React is basically the URL, and we will push there, and we will add the offer ID as a query parameter. And whenever you now click the button, it will create the offer and push you to the next micro-frontend, which then basically can do the exact opposite. It can read from the URL by using the location, extract the offer ID, and then go to the offer API again, load all the data it needs, and then might display it. There is still a challenge because not everything really belongs to the backend, and not all state that you want to have in your front end belongs to the backend as well, because you might want to have data or information that you just want to react on. And therefore, we try to make use of custom events. Custom events are a super lightweight browser native API. That means you can use it across all the browsers and you can use it across all frameworks, which makes it really proficient for us because we don't know which framework will come into our platform or into our product. Custom events are super simple to create. Basically, in the first line, you can see how you create a custom event. You can just call the initializer with an event name and some optional data if you want to. And in the second line, we can see how we add an event listener to any DOM element. Basically, you also need to provide the event that you want to listen to, which in this case is printed. And the second parameter is then a callback function that will receive your event whenever one is dispatched, and you can react on the event there. The last line that you can see is also registering on a DOM node the function to dispatch an event so that you can send it out into the DOM. So let's take a closer example why events are so powerful. And they are basically super powerful if you want to react on certain actions that happened on your stage, even across multiple micro-frontends. Let's take an example here. We have a print button and we just want to dispatch one event that whatever happens, it just printed something. That might not be a super sufficient example here because in reality, code might get a bit more complex, but for our use case, that's totally fine. So it will create a custom event here and then it will just dispatch the event. And on the other side, we have a banner, and this banner wants to react to that. It will just show like, okay, hey, you just printed something. The slide is a bit more complex due to the life cycle of some components, because actually, if you want to add an event listener, you also want to remove that event listener whenever your component gets unmounted again. But I don't want to go into details there. One small hint exactly about life cycles is you need to be careful when using events across different pages or different components, because sometimes the life cycle of your micro-frontend or of your components that are below your micro-frontend is not ready or in the right state. So your component might not be mounted, which means that your event listener is not there and cannot react to the events that are dispatched, which makes it super hard to also track down errors. So you need to be careful when doing that. So we favor to use it just on the same page and using it for actions that we can directly react on. But therefore, it's a super lightweight way of doing that. So let's bubble up everything that we just heard. The first statement that we want to bring is we want to use local state over global state, because for us, it makes it way easier to access an API instead of going through a shared state across multiple micro-frontends. And in an ideal world, our micro-frontends would look like that in the end, that we have one state for one micro-frontend, which is then interacting between the components, and the micro-frontend sync their state with our backends, because that makes it for our application very easily. The second thing that we want to highlight is try to separate state from the presentational logic, because for us, it always helped us to evolve our state solution just by splitting these two things. It also helps us to reuse presentational components and have state handling components next to them that can just provide that state to these presentational components. And the last thing, I think that's like the major outcome of our talk, that it's really nice if you evolve your state solution along with your architecture. So as we have seen in Andrei's part of the presentation, in the early beginnings, our state reducer was totally fine for us and it worked out great. It had the proper requirements that we needed at that time. But as we scaled our product, it wasn't really sufficient anymore, and we needed to think about different things. And we didn't really tie our solution too close to a framework or to a library. We were able to really change and evolve our solution over and over again, which helped us to find always the right thing that we need at the current time for our current requirements. Yep, and that's basically it. Thanks a lot. If you have any questions, we are really happy to answer them. And we will also hang out in Slack to chat a bit more in detail about that all with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrei and Han. We have a couple of minutes for questions. If people have more, you can ask on the Q&A session, but I have some, so I will go ahead and use my facilitation powers. First of all, I love the way you approach it as a storytelling. I myself are a big fan of explanation through storytelling. It makes it easier to grasp and understand. I also had some flashbacks into a project that I worked before where the idea of having a shared library was from the beginning, even though we only had one consumer. So we were going through all of those deployment issues for ourselves. So it was very, I couldn't help but smile to myself. We have a question on chat from Victor, where he's asking about using the backend from a solution, an API. Wouldn't you maybe hit some quotas for your API, like multiple calls to your API? Did you face anything? Did you have those conversations as pros and cons and drawbacks, and how did those conversations evolve?
So we controlled the backend, and it was very, very close to our team. It lied more or less on the same, I wouldn't say on cloud because I would be lying. It's an on-premise solution. So that made it easy. And where we had actually problems with this rate limiting, we actually built something in front of it to try to mitigate it. And of course, then you can start adding some caching solutions and deal with it on demand. Yeah,
exactly.
Something to add?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that in the beginning, we were always also afraid of just having multiple calls to the backend, but it really played out nicely. So I think we were more afraid of doing a call into the backend than thinking about it if it really impacts our application too badly. And that really played nice. And as Andrei said, there are plenty of solutions to make that faster or to cache things. So that really helped here.
And I would say, like Andrei said, it helped that you had a very close communication with the team that actually did the backend. Would that have been something that might make you reconsider if that would not be the case? Or the pros would outweigh the cons here?
think that's hard to answer. I think it's
Agreed.
sometimes now I want to bring the normal consultant answer. It depends. I think depends on the API that you're consuming, because there can be really nice APIs, they can be really fast, but sometimes there are legacy systems that you need to interact with. So we have one very big customer relation management system, which was written 20 years ago, and it's awfully slow. And there it's super nice to have our backend in front of it to basically have a nice structure, have a proper API that we can interact with, and have some caching, for example. But I think it always depends on the solution that you're interacting, and then it makes more sense. Andrei, do you want to add something?
I think there are also additional solutions to handle this in the front end. So how progressive apps go ahead, and there's a lot of like plumbing you can now do also in the front end in case you don't have access to a nice API.
That makes sense. A follow-up to that, a very nice one, comes from Matthias on the question on the Q&A. If we have two microservices requesting the same URL, are they made independently, or are there any optimization done? So if you end up requesting the same through micro-frontend, requesting the same thing from the same API, they are independent as the micro-frontends are independent.
I think it depends on your cache solution that you have. For example, if you have backend caching, then it will still be fast, right? Because you still access the same data, and the backend will basically know that and know that it didn't upgrade. But I think the hard thing there is then to do cache invalidation. So for us, we have that case where we request multiple times the same object, but that object is also pretty small, because we always try to only put IDs in there, that whenever we need to talk to or need to get more information, we will talk to another API, so that we have the shared state as small as possible, so that every micro frontend can then decide whether it needs data or whether it not needs that data. I think that was really a nice solution for us, to have it as small and as slim as possible.
Yeah, I think in that solution, you probably have to examine with how many APIs later down the road you need to talk to. And in our case, the answer is a lot. Hence why we have this two-step in the backend, and we have for that contract testing, so that makes it super easy to collaborate even between teams.
I see. Yeah, it's hard to understand all of the aspects that you're going to get and how to properly handle all of those. Just thinking about using APIs as state management and having cache and validation and all of those things sounds already like a very interesting problem there to solve. One thing that I was thinking throughout as you were taking us through this journey that happened for I don't know how long time in reality for you guys. It's interesting that in the end you showed about 4 options about how to solve this problem, and it seems like you ended up with a mixed one, right? There's no right way to do it. There's no silver bullet. So you try to turn the problem into smaller problems, and then you find where best fits. So I think that's a great metaphor for everything, not only for the particular problem that you're solving. I'm wondering, with the power of hindsight, right, that you went through one-page application and then through this, so the next thing that we're going to do is just have micro-frontends and share the state to where you're at now. Do you think that this is from not being perfectionist, doing the decisions at the less responsible moment? Do you think that this is a journey that still makes sense, even though you didn't end up there? Or would you advocate for, okay, you have a simple one, but there's a moment where things switch, it becomes complicated enough, and then you should just try to move through this more lean, micro front-ended, shared small scope situation?
I think we kind of went with what one of the talks was saying today about this evolutionary architecture. We did not know actually where it might lead. We had no idea about how many teams would come. I think when I joined the project initially, it was not clear at all. And we just went slowly, felt a bit of pain. Okay, what's the pain? let's try to fix it. What are the solutions? What are the limiting factors? Because we did, and we still do have a lot of limiting factors, and even applying this runtime integration is not so straightforward. We have another issue in there, so it could make for a whole new talk. The whole thing. I think the bottom line is don't try to over-engineer it. Go as simple as, or also what you know. What does the team know right now? The team knows just React. Great. Start with React. Get something, get some data, see how people like it, see what comes over, and move on slowly.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point there, that you also have to consider your teams that are working on that project and to know about their knowledge base and how fast you can really evolve throughout all the different solutions. Because actually the last step took us the longest, because we're adding so much complexity to the whole thing and changing the whole state handling. It actually uses some time to really get comfortable with that solution.
Yeah, if I could hook into that, was there something that at this point in time, because we were talking about tech debt earlier, right? And was there something that happened at this point in time? They're like, okay, now we need to pay it back. Now, if we continue here, it's going to be more negative, more detrimental than positive. Is there anything you can share about tidbits about that point in time where you were going through?
Yeah, you want to answer that?
Yeah, basically it was the build time integration that was, I guess, the heaviest moment that we had, because it's creating such a pain after a while when you're having multiple teams that always need to upgrade that common library, and all the other teams have to react on that. They always have to upgrade their own their library, their dependency, and then manage to change their state in order to maybe ship a feature of a different team. And that really hurted us, and that really slowed down the overall product development in that time. And yeah, that was also the point where we faced like, okay, we have to change that now. Otherwise it will not possible to basically satisfy the client anymore.
You were getting a bad time to market score there to some point. How do you nowadays decide whether something should be moved to the API, to the backend, or it's enough to be done via custom event throughout micro-frontends communicating? Is it more like a gut feeling between the developers, or learn as we go, move if needed type situation?
How important is it? So would it pain? Would it be care if someone would never listen to that event? If the answer is no, that's not such a big deal, then why not keep it as an event? Is it actually an event? Do we want to put real data in there? Do we have to put real data? Then maybe not.
That's an interesting heuristics, and ties back to what you were saying, right? That the default should be that you should ask, why should you put it on the global state, not the inverse, yes. Right? You should aim for localized instead of global, and then you have to have a good answer for this should be global. That makes sense. We have a question again from the Zoom from Andy. Did you try, or is it possible, or did you have conversations to have that shared state in a cookie or browser storage or some other type of non-API based? And yeah. Why didn't you go through that approach?
Basically, in the beginning, when we had that common library, we also used the local session storage of the browser to basically maintain the states throughout some browser sessions. But that also makes the whole state handling quite complex, because you always need to care about, okay, does that state should be persistent, and how long should it be persisted, as well as when is it in persistence? So when do we need to delete that? And this whole logic that we put there was simply getting too complex over the time. And then it's easier to do it in the backend, because there we exactly know, okay, this data needs to be persisted throughout the application lifetime, or throughout the use time of that information. And we had some other things that don't need to go into that into the backend at all, because it's just some information that flows around in the front end. For example, we sometimes want to show some special data to our users, and that's something that should not live in the backend. It should just be an event, for example, hey, now all the components need to show that data.
I see. Makes sense. And by the way, just our speakers will be available on Slack. So if I'm not doing your question justice, please interact with them from there. We have another one that is about, have you had issues to integrate your state and how it does with maybe some plugin or maybe some other component that you might require, or are you building everything in-house and then everything is taking that into account?
If you're referring to additional libraries for state management, we try to keep it limited. And with the last, not the last version, what was 16. I forgot the version of React, which provided state management, the reducer. We simply we were curious, hey, we have this thing already in the trunk. Let's put it out and see what we can do with it. Now going forward, would we consider, if the need comes, I think we'd try to stay away from additional things, because additional libraries because it might mean that new members, new teams need to adhere to a whole dance, so a whole scenario. And we think that because of the different teams and so much, it could be a lot more complicated for us to handle. So keeping it as simple as possible, communicating with IDs, for example, over APIs, since that's possible, why not take it for grabs? And yeah, we didn't try to answer the question in the short.
I mean, that's a valid answer, right? I have a final one, and I think we have about maybe 3 minutes. And you mentioned it's interesting because if I didn't get this wrong, you started with a single page application, but with pure React, right? Without adding Redux or any other form of things, which to me makes it interesting because it seems like you had the lean and the least integration as possible mentality from the beginning, right? Which I think kind of helped, at least based on my experience with Redux and all of those things. How much of a beast was it to extract all of those things in a, like, I'm just going personally to hear, were you like, this is going to take a long time, I'm afraid this is going to break? Or was it like, we already had that mentality from the beginning, then it's just the next step on our evolution?
One Friday afternoon, I had a bit of free time. Created the reducer, bam, showed it to the team in a dev huddle, and ship it.
And that was it.
Yeah. For the reducer, it was basically exactly like that. I think the next integration step, like going to that backend solution, took way longer, because then the whole application grew basically 1 year with that reducer in there. And then we decided to, okay, now we need to split that. And that's currently still an ongoing process, because we always need to make sure that everything still works, right? Because we don't want to break any of our integrations, and some product teams are not that far currently, so they cannot make use of that API. So that makes it also quite complicated. So some of our integrations are already migrated to the new style, and some of them are not. So we are currently running like a two-phase thing, but we are looking forward to migrate it over the next couple of months, probably. Hopefully. Hopefully.
Well, it is said, it is out in the world now, so it has to come true. So I think that's we're at about time. We'll have a short 5-minute break now, and we'll come back at the top of the hour for our keynote, Music as Code Performance. Thank you very much for our speakers, Andrei and Jan. They will be available on Slack if anybody has questions, or if they want to re-ask it because I maybe misunderstood something they will be more than glad to answer and to fix my possible mistakes.